I think if you only think about, again, software as code, then yeah, sure, the SaaS-pocalypse is very, very real. And if you're like a very thin wrapper around, foundational models, then, again, I think Sam Altman said that he wouldn't want to be one of the companies that are fearing the next model release from OpenAI or Anthropic for that matter. I think that very much holds true.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Future Proof. Today I'm sitting down with Morten Bruun, who is a product manager at Hebbia AI, which is a platform for finance and legal professionals. We talk about how Hebbia is differentiating from standard off-the-shelf AI tools and what they've learned in building specifically for the finance and legal domain, all of the kinds of things that you'll have to consider when building out for those types of customers. We also talk about the SaaS-pocalypse, kind of Morten's reactions to that and how SaaS companies can continue to differentiate and provide value for their customers. So stay tuned. I think you'll find this one really interesting, and I'm excited to hear what you think. Morten, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So I was hoping that you could start by telling us a little bit about your journey into Hebbia. You originally co-founded a company called FlashDocs, which ended up getting acquired by Hebbia. Tell us a little bit about your journey and what you're up to now.
Yeah, 100%. So I spent the most of my career in tech, started at Google, then went to McKinsey after business school, joined a startup, and then ultimately started FlashDocs, what is now a little bit more than 2 years ago. And we were really trying to sort of solve this problem of automating PowerPoints. At the time, LLMs were not good enough at writing XML, which is sort of the building blocks of PowerPoint from a coding perspective. So we built a technology that allowed them to do that, or allowed us to build PowerPoints using AI. We started building a bit of like an application layer product and found some success with that. But then especially as like AI agents really started taking off, we started getting a lot of demand from other companies that wanted to build slide generation capabilities into their product. So if you're building AI for finance like Hebbia, or AI for consulting, or AI for sales, or anyone who's building PowerPoints as part of their work, we kind of became an interesting API. So I ended up with a number of exciting clients across the AI spectrum, and some of the largest tech companies in the world were using our API as well. So we kind of went from being a bit of like a smaller add-in in PowerPoint to be the number one tool for automating PowerPoints. And yeah, then Hebbia was one of our clients. We really liked working with them a lot. So when George, the CEO, reached out and asked if we could consider joining forces, it was a bit of a no-brainer.
That's awesome. And have you folded sort of the functionality of that original slide generation into Hebbia, or tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
Yeah, that was really the first thing that we did. So Hebbia was a client, so they had already started using the API, but of course there was much more that we could layer into that. So that was really like the first part of the work, was sort of layering all of our functionality into Hebbia. Then I think as probably anyone who's working in AI is experiencing, like the bar keeps pushing. So work wasn't done just when we had integrated FlashDocs into Hebbia. Like, so we're still sort of continuing to pushing the boundaries and everything touching PowerPoint generation and so on.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's cool to, start with that alongside a former customer who was already really familiar with everything that you did and understood immediately why it was so valuable. I want to kind of shift over to the Hebbia platform itself in general and talk a little bit more about, where these finance teams and investment banks are really finding value in your platform. Of course, I think everybody is kind of many companies in the space are looking at, how do we get LLMs to look at a bunch of documents and generate some insights from it. Tell us a little bit about like sort of how Hebbia has found a niche within that space and what sort of the core value that users are getting out of the platform. What's sort of the secret sauce, if you will, for those teams that are using it?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of it comes down to the clients that we work with. So when you work in finance, being average is really meaningless. You always want to have edge in the market. So you don't just care about sort of being able to roughly like analyze documents and broadly understand, um, a folder of files or whatever it might be. You're really, really interested in getting, just a little bit ahead of the market all the time. So our users care a lot about how we're able to extract information across very, very large amounts of documents. So when we started, or when Hebbia got started, the context window was maybe like, a couple of thousand tokens, and that has obviously grown into being millions. But already back then, like, a lot of what made us special was our ability to kind of like, push the limits for the amount of data that you can analyze. So as an investor, when AI first sort of started really gaining traction, you couldn't even analyze, the earnings report from Apple. And then of course it's like the context window started increasing, then you could do more and more analysis, but fundamentally that is still like part of the problem that investors are dealing with. So once you started to be able to analyze Apple's earnings calls, you wanted to be able to analyze, you know their last 2 years of earnings calls, and you want to analyze all tech companies and their last earnings calls in the last couple of years, and sort of you keep kind of like pushing that forward. So I think information retrieval and being able to actually understand context and understand a large amount of content continues to be something that gives competitive edge for our clients. Then increasingly we also see that it's not just about being able to extract the content, but also what you do with it. And that's also where we do a lot of, I think forward deployed is being sort of maybe a little bit overused, but we do a lot around sort of process engineering, trying to understand in detail, how does our clients work. I think when you zoom out and you look at, the 30,000-foot view of what an investor do, it's easy to say, okay, we analyze some documents and we maybe create an Excel model and an IC memo. And when you look at it from that 30,000-foot view, that's really the sort of the extent of it. But when you actually go deeper, all of those items breaks into quite sort of specific processes that are not just specific for each single firm, but can be specific for each single team. So the private credit team at a client might work from in a different way than the equities team is working, and so on. So being able to also like not just extract information and retrieve information, but also wrap it around a team specific process and keep sort of making it more and more specific for how they work and generate outputs that matches how they work is a lot of what gives our users or our clients edge in the market.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and makes sense what you said about how the difficulty is not in necessarily summarizing a document or just getting the very basics out of it. Of course, anybody can throw that into a basic chat product that really everybody has access to now, right? And it's kind of interesting that instead you're talking about how you can incorporate AI layers into some of the existing workflows that might be very complicated depending on the organization that you're working with. I'm
Mm.
curious, like if you can tell us about maybe some of the use cases you're seeing, or like where maybe like knowing the process in more detail really helps you tune the product or tune the maybe like the attention of like where the LM is spending time, like what documents it chooses to bring into its context window and what it chooses to ignore. Like
Yeah.
does like the consolidation of some of those use cases kind of help you make it that
Mm.
much better than an off the shelf, say, Claude for Google, Google Sheets, or Claude for Google Drive,
Right.
yeah. Is that what you're finding? And can you tell us a little bit about those use cases?
Yeah, 100%. I can maybe give two different examples. So I think one on the retrieval side, and then a little bit one more on sort of, the output side, touching on the processes there. So I think if you think about retrieval, right, like, you know, Claude, I think the max is you can probably upload what, 20 documents or so right now if you're on like a max plan. Um that really doesn't get you that far when it comes to sort of being an investor. Our clients, and we're privileged to work with some of the leading institutions within finance, they look at, really the mountain of data that they sit on, and they're like, hey, we have terabytes of unstructured documents, IC memos, due diligence reports that have sort of painstakingly been put together by some of the, hardest working, most qualified professionals in the field over like decades. And those documents include key insights on how we analyze businesses, on our point of view on certain companies, on specific industries, but they are also like this repository of, institutionalized knowledge about how do we approach analyzing the risks within, a supply chain heavy business, for instance. And being able to extract those insight and not just think about, okay, how can we make this one individual work more efficiently, but how can we actually use really an institutionalized body of knowledge to make the entire firm much better. And I think that's also where you see, you know these ideas of retrieval and sort of expanding the context window, where they really come into play, is when you're not just thinking about, okay, how can I analyze 20 documents, but how can I really make a tool that works across like terabytes of data, and do that in a way where it's not just picking up on sort of, specific elements that you might be able to do with things like RAG, but where you actually want a much more sort of holistic understanding of the context. An investor looking at whether it's a good idea to invest into a specific company and is trying to analyze a virtual data room, for instance, it's not just interested in extracting out the revenue numbers for certain years. They might want to do that, but they also want to understand, what's the entire context around that? What's the customer concentration? What has been the market pressure on sort of industries that are related to this client? What might be drivers of margin compression, and how does that change over time? So the complexity of the questions is just different when we think about sort of just the retrieval aspects. The volume is very different as well. So I think that's a little bit on the retrieval side. When you look at then generating the output, and again, that falls very close to my area when it comes to generating PowerPoints. Again, when you look at it, and even when we talk to our clients, we're like, so how do you generate, say, an IC memo or a SIM, like typical sort of finance documents? Even our clients might say, hey, they follow a certain template and they work more or less the same way at the same time. But just yesterday, I was talking to a client and they wanted to automate their SIMs, which is essential documents for them. And they were like, yeah, it kind of more or less looks the same all the time. And they sent me 3 different examples, and there were literally not a single slide that was the same. And of course, when you look at it, they do follow the same structure. Like each sim is not like, fundamentally brand new document. But when we sort of want to understand what then makes a good sim, it's not just understanding, oh, it has like these, I don't know, 35 different pages, and page 1 to 5 is generally about this and so on. You actually have to understand what sort of made the investor, when they were putting together this PowerPoint, choose to use this specific layout to communicate this specific point, and how did they phrase it, and so on and so forth. So in order for you to create something that's actually what the output that they're looking for, you need to do more than just sort of have a high level, sort of somewhat pixelated understanding of it. And our clients are just dealing in a space where even if you're 90% right and you sort of do a really good first pass at something, it's fundamentally still 100% wrong. So getting not just to like a 80 or 90% correct understanding of what the outputs that they're looking for, that's actually not where what our clients want. They want something that get them all the way to the 100%. So in so many ways, like the last mile for us, it's the entire game. And so a lot of the general foundational models out there will do a pretty good job at getting you to that 90%. But for our clients, like, they think that's great, but they also care, a lot about getting that last mile in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense what you said about that last mile actually being so much of like where Hebbia can provide that value over stock foundation model behavior. I think like the non-domain specific kind of parallel to that is a common thing that people will almost benchmark LLMs on is like how what is the quality of like the landing pages, like the static landing pages that this LLM can develop. And I
Hmm.
think like people have generally seen that there's kind of an LLM like vibe coded feeling to some of the landing pages that it can generate, which really like is the reason why you would never push that out to production as your marketing site because
Hmm.
it feels like it was generated by an AI. Like it doesn't have like that storytelling or any of that, the qualities that would really make a highly performing page. It's just it feels
Hmm.
very generic in that way. So I can imagine that that's even more amplified when you take it to a specific domain where like yeah, like every slide is going to be custom to tell us very specific narrative within the context of finance. And yeah, like that it's going to matter so much more there than just generating marketing sites. So super interesting to hear kind of how like even the output itself, like for sure needs to have that kind of specificity and that knowing the domain and like having a lot of examples from customers, working directly with them to understand like how they want the output can make a lot
Hmm.
of sense and where you can provide a lot of value.
Yeah, and I think fundamentally it also comes down to sort of like, well, what are you trying to achieve, right? And there are lots of businesses who, or have certain processes or things that they do where maybe it does not need to sort of be, the best. But there are lots of tools out there, like, if you want to be the best designer, you're using Midjourney, even though like you can get pretty good sort of design out of using, I don't know, Nano Banana or something similar, right? But if you really care fundamentally deeply about your craft, as you do when you're a builder or founder and you care about how a landing page looks like, it doesn't really sort of get the job done to have like an average looking, landing page, if that's the landing page that fundamentally drives, the majority of your inbound leads. And I think the interesting thing for finance is that that's kind of like, it's like that, but sort of 10x, because like, you know, the decisions that our clients makes are literally driving, millions of dollars in value, or billions of dollars, if maybe even more so, right? So so for our clients, like, it's really a matter of like quite large sort of financial outcomes that comes down to your ability to generate something that's not just the average Excel model or the average slide deck or the average analysis of something, but you really all the time wants to do something that's different than the average. The average will just give you market returns, and that's really not like, then you're fired, right? That's not what an investor is sort of put in the world to do. They're put into the world to generate outsized outcomes, and you only can do that if you're a little bit better than the market or think a little bit differently about these things. So again, I think for our clients, as soon as GPT can do it, or as soon as Claude can do it, it kind of almost becomes a little bit worthless, because then everyone can do it, and then it doesn't have that edge anymore, and then you constantly need to sort of like, go chase the next thing. And I think a lot of us are probably feeling it these days, that like, the best in class website that was like, the going standard like 6 months ago, like that game has sort of like upped itself. And for our clients, that's just a matter of sort of professional pride, and obviously wanted to sort of try outcomes, is fundamentally a matter of like, many millions that's on the line each single day.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of makes me think then, like, for each Hebbia customer, then is the way that they use Hebbia like very different? Like, I imagine that it doesn't, when you're actually using the product, that you're adding a lot of your own sort of unique spin on like the analysis, or adding a little bit of like you said, maybe it's process, but I'm
Hmm.
curious, like when a customer is actually implementing Hebbia, like what is sort of their level of configuration? Like are each are the stock tools kind of like what they're using within your product, and how do they differentiate, like, I guess, even their usage of it, given
Right.
let's say all financial firms are using Hebbia now, it kind of becomes the Claude or ChatGPT, so to speak, for that category. I'm curious, like, is it more like a canvas where people, design sort of like analysis or process, and they can add their sort of unique insight or configuration on top of it?
Yeah, I think I like the way of sort of framing it as a bit of a canvas. So when we implement with a client, we go quite sort of deep in making sure that the way that we configure the platform and the way that we sort of onboard them and so on gets specific to, again, their process and the type of problems that they want to solve for. So we have a quite large team of AI strategists, and they're all former, finance professionals, or legal professionals. So they come from banking or PE, and so on. And so they get paired up with clients within their domain. So they are actually able to sort of say, okay, I have the expertise from working in that field myself, and now my job is to go and understand this specific firm and this specific team in detail, and try to understand how can I then shape this canvas into being ultimately a useful tool for this team. Um, Now, when you look at the platform, there's obviously a number of different use cases, and it differs a lot from client to client how they use them. And you can, of course, use Hebbia as like, your general go-to AI tool for questions and research and whatnot. But I think some of the very powerful use cases that we see are use cases where we're able to really like leverage the data that they already have. So we integrate with, their SharePoint folders, and they can set up, projects, or sort of almost like a deal room or a project space where they can sort of add their documents, and they can add instructions on how they ideally would want to work. That's something that we also like capture and learn over time, right? So you should generally feel that the tool is getting better as you continue to use it. And then what we're able to do, which I think is still quite unique, is we're basically able to, over a like very vast amount of data, extract insights. So coming back to this idea of terabytes of data, I was working with a client yesterday who wanted to set up a space where they could analyze basically all their IC memos that they've done within that specific practice, and then analyze it and almost use it as a bit of like a brain for how they should think about, new deals that comes along. So what you have is essentially like, you know a folder, or a space with, in their case, like 1,500 documents, right? And each of these documents are maybe on average like, I don't know, 30 pages long. So you really have like 50,000 pages, and they wanted to drill that down into, I think 60 different analysis. Each of these analysis, being very specific about what they wanted the output to look like, how it should be set up, whether it's tables or, Harvey balls showing, scoring it in different ways. Some of the analysis might sort of lean on one another. So there's like cross-referencing across all these different things. Maybe you also want to enrich it with, say, web data or data from, I don't know, FactSet or PitchBook or any sort of like finance specific tool. And then ultimately you would want to then see all these different analyses across 1,500 documents, across 30 pages in each single document, and then be able to tie that back and say, okay, the reason why we scored this, I don't know, a 3 out of 5 was because on page 17 in this document and on page 19 in this document it said X, Y, and Z, and that's kind of like the reasoning that we do over it. Those are use cases that I think are just so hard to actually like unlock, and it drives so much values for these teams because again, they are, truly professional knowledge workers. So their entire edge sits in that sort of knowledge base. And our ability to be able to take that amount of data and structure it in a way, allow them to customize their analysis and make sure that the output and the analysis come out the exact way that they want. And then they can chat over it and query over it. And, that is something that's quite powerful. And you really only get there if you really dive in, understand the specific processes and how these teams are working, what matters for them, and then building the tool or shaping that canvas around that.
Yeah, I love that idea that you kind of alluded to, which is like process engineering or almost like forward deployed, where you're working very closely alongside of a customer to deeply understand their needs and sort of the unique data that they may have available to them to really
Mm,
customize Hebbia to get the most out of the platform in general. And so that makes sense. That I would imagine that maybe people's different customers' various setups of Hebbia could look quite different, or what they get
yeah.
out of it could be quite different. I'm curious, I know that, Heavy is more of a tool for finance and legal teams, but I'm curious if your team, your product development team, has also used your product in any interesting ways. Because I would imagine that, that same kind of analysis could be applied to other domains, potentially product development as well. But does the
Mm.
Hebbia team use Hebbia to help you build it?
Yeah, I think fundamentally we're big believers in eating our own dog food here, and I also think the while we do focus on finance and legal, the reason why we think that's fundamentally interesting is just because the marginal value or the marginal utility of getting things right in finance or legal is super high, because there's always, like, again, millions or tens of millions dollars on the line if it's, I don't know, a lawsuit or you're evaluating a deal or whatnot. So we think that if we can solve for that problem, a lot of other sort of knowledge work problem will be something that we can also address. So to your question, yeah, we do use Heavy a lot internally. Maybe, two examples as of recently. Uh, we just presented our product strategy lately, and we were crafting slides for that. We do that in Hebbia, where we have all the best layouts, the slides that we've used before, and again, Hebbia sort of learns based off of that. So it's really good at sort of thinking, oh, you want to communicate this point. We know that previously you've sort of used similar type of layouts or these types of slides to communicate those points. Maybe we can leverage some of those designs and tweak them a little bit to the specific slide they want to create for this product strategy. And that's kind of like how we put together the deck. Another thing that we use it for, coming back to this example of like analyzing unstructured data at scale, is that I think a lot of what I find as a product manager being really interesting to analyze is really like unstructured data, raw transcripts, meeting notes that I have, and so on, and then testing different hypotheses against those, trying to extract what are sort of the key points, and maybe do that on a per transcript basis, because I want to be able to drill down and know that this customer said this specific thing. But I, of course, also want to sort of zoom out and abstract away and sort of think about, okay, if I'm not just analyzing one call, but trying to get insights from hundreds of different calls, what are like the most impactful features that we can build. So I have a matrix, which is sort of our product for analyzing these things at scale, where I load in all the different transcripts, my notes over the course of a quarter, and I also like forward emails, so that gets indexed as well, and it basically becomes this repository of database where I can ask questions, and then I can do these like drill down analysis to understand, you know within PowerPoint, like what is the main feedback that we're getting, and so on and so forth. So we try to use it a lot internally, and I think especially for product, there's lots of really interesting use cases there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That does sound like a really cool use case to be able to analyze all of that unstructured data, collect those themes, and certainly there's a lot of, maybe even subtle like types of requests that can pop in, and I imagine that the Hebbia platform is super helpful in bringing some of those out and citing those in answers to questions. One thing that I noticed is that your title is member of technical staff, and certainly that sort of mirrors some of the AI labs. They've also chosen to use that label. I'm curious, does that reflect a specific org structure that you guys have decided on for developing the product, or yeah, has like anything about sort of like the role of like product and engineering internally, has it shifted in response to using some of these tools or perhaps coding agents? Um, or is that sort of just the new term that we're using for some of these things? I'm curious what that's about.
Yeah, it's a good question, man. Like, I don't know. I kind of came into product from I guess a bit of like an odd background in some ways, in the sense that I mainly been a founder and a builder more so than sort of a traditionally schooled PM. So for me, I had to learn a lot of things, but it's also been quite remarkable how much has shifted in the last 6 months. I think if I were to put a number on it, maybe 10% of how I worked 6 months ago is how I still work. The rest 90% has shifted dramatically. I find myself again sort of mainly leveraging different AI tools, and I also think the output that I create now is less about sort of, you know, writing and, helping shape design, commenting on Figmas or whatever it might be. Now it's much more focused on building, and I think I see that across the board. The way that we're organized is that both engineering and product and design rolls up into our CTO Abbas. So I think sort of reporting line, we're all part of a technical team, whether you're design, engineering, and product. And across the board, we're all essentially writing code in one shape or another. So I think that has changed drastically. And I think what it allows, especially product managers to do, and designers as well for that matter, is to move from a world where things were mainly sort of done on paper in one form or the other, meaning that you spend time sort of like interviewing clients, getting a bit of like a pixelated, view on the features that they like. Then you try to like, abstract away the sort of key findings there. Maybe you talk to internal teams, you do some market research, you look at some data, and you kind of like get this at an abstracted layer. You get really like the feedback and direction on what the product, and then you spend time writing PRDs, trying to get thoughts on paper, getting feedback on it, hydrating it a lot so that you get, you know, to kind of start shaping whatever the features should look like. And you do all of that to ultimately de-risk engineering spending time building something that once it sort of lands in the hands of customers, it addresses the problem that you set out to solve. And I think a lot of that is not that it has sort of gone away, but it has changed drastically. And then I think the second thing that has happened is that loop between when you first start doing discovery work on a feature to you being able to put it in the hands of clients or internal teams for dog fooding or whatever it might be, that loop has been compressed so much that like right now, from having an idea or some type of like thought around what you might want to build next, you can actually just build it. So, and I see that happening across, of course, engineering. Like that loop has like really shortened. We do that in product as well, but also our designers are more often like not just designing sort of static figmas, but are thinking through like what should the interaction look like when I click this thing, like what actually happens, like what does our loading stage looks like, and what does could different animation look like, and it really makes the product come alive in a different way than it did maybe 6 months ago, where it was tied to you know some static Figma frames and a POD with a write up on what it should feel like. But now you can actually put your hands on it and try it out and click around, and I think that has changed a lot in terms of again de-risking that we're not building something that ultimately doesn't feel intuitive when clients get their hands on it. We used to do that more theoretically, and now I see us doing it much more practically. And reporting wise, I think that kind of means that these roles are converging more and more. And I think if you're being an engineer that's just focused on coding and just executing, something that product throws over to you, I think that's can be a quite tough role to be in. The engineers are able to be much more, owners together with product and design, thinking about what type of problems are we fundamentally trying to solve, what do we actually want to build, also like long term in the product, are much more effective. So I think that, I don't know if it's PMs becoming more like engineers and vice versa, or if it's more that we're all becoming more like GMs and trying to get closer to the actual clients and understand how they operate. I think they're all sort of like riffs on the same type of like of the same situation, which is that we need to get much closer in understanding our clients, and we need to be much sort of faster at putting things in the front of real users who can test and help validate different hypotheses.
Yeah, definitely. And what you said is so accurate. The compression of the feedback loop that is 100% happening. The way I've kind of thought about it is like the medium of thinking. Like you said, it's kind of
Mm,
shifted. The medium of thinking has shifted from like pen and paper or like interviews and maybe static prototypes. I mean, it used to take hours to really prototype a high fidelity interaction, right? But
mm,
now like you can really think with a coding agent to prototype it live, and that can be like
mm,
a semi working feature. You can get to those conclusions much faster than if you had spent hours trying to build a high fidelity sort of like prototype model in like one of those older prototype like high fidelity prototyping tools. So yeah,
mm.
it's super interesting and definitely has shaped product development. It sounds like at Hebbia, definitely at Paragon as well. I think like the kind of slightly more negative angle on that, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, is that as like the cost of like engineering things and building software has just gone down, and like that is no longer a barrier necessarily for someone just entering a new space and like building out a new product. Like that is now something that AI models are capable of, and a small team is capable of. And certainly like the public markets are sort of reacting to this. There's the much has been made of the SaaS-pocalypse. I'm curious
Mm.
to kind of get your thoughts on that, and kind of hear, where that is, where that reaction is justified or maybe not justified, and how SaaS companies can continue to sort of differentiate in this new world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think if you purely look at software, like the value of software as being the code that's written, then for sure, like the ability for everyone to now write code and do it much faster, that has obviously changed the game. Um, but you know, I think the fact that code gets cheaper, you know, doesn't mean weakening the moats as such, right? Like, I think a lot of what makes great software great is really how it becomes part of, like, fundamentally the customer's workflow or that institution that you work for. And I think that comes a lot back to, the understanding again of those processes and how well you wrap around that. I think if you look at a space like, finance, the reason why Bloomberg is very, very sticky is not per se that, I'm not saying that it's going to be easy just to replicate Bloomberg, but it's just as much that you have, like, generations and generations of finance professionals who have worked in Bloomberg and have their workflows in Bloomberg and have been trained on Bloomberg, and has a lot of knowledge in Bloomberg. They have, messaging channels in Bloomberg and different analysis in Bloomberg. So all of a sudden you have this like idea of a truly institutionalized tool where I'm sure, there's a world in which you go out and you vibe code a new Bloomberg, but that even if you could do that, and even if you could replicate Bloomberg, that doesn't mean that you can just like switch it over. And so I think we sometimes like actually underestimate the sort of stickiness of being like truly embedded into some of these workflows. That doesn't mean that there's not a sort of threat if you're a legacy platform for new AI tools that are coming out. And I think you do need to fundamentally rethink a lot about like how you've built your software, and some of the features that might be true in sort of like a pre-AI world might need to be rethought completely. It opens up the door for a lot of like new use cases that we couldn't really solve before. And I think your ability to adapt to that is going to be hugely important. But I think if you only think about, again, software as code, then yeah, sure, the SaaS-pocalypse is very, very real. And if you're like a very thin wrapper around, foundational models, then, again, I think Sam Altman said that he wouldn't want to be one of the companies that are fearing the next model release from OpenAI or Anthropic for that matter. I think that very much holds true. But I think if you're in a space where, again, the workflows that you're trying to build are not generally sort of just like vanilla, generally applicable workflows, but are quite sort of specific, and means that you have to have a very, very specific understanding of the client, how they operate, and again, how they do their analysis and what type of output that they're looking for, and the ability to learn and build those things into the software as more of an organic thing over time. I think those products, have really only been amplified by, it being faster and easier to ship software rather than having sort of been, been threatened by it.
Appreciate that. Yeah, and it's a good reminder too that people don't buy software for the code that it is. People buy software because it provides them some value as a user at the end of the day.
Mm,
And so certainly, yes, that does require a really deep understanding of kind of what they want, what they're getting out of it, and not just the fact that it exists and it's coded a particular way. So yeah,
mm.
thank you for kind of sharing your perspective on that. Maybe as kind of a last question that I'm curious to get your thoughts on. As maybe some of our listeners like are maybe working with finance or legal teams or just yeah, maybe thinking about building a product in that space. Do you have any kind of like lessons you've learned or things you've learned about winning trust within those spaces? Like, they're very highly regulated industries. These customers have, obviously very high enterprise and compliance requirements, but anything that maybe has surprised you working with these customers about, sort of like what they're looking for and like how you can provide value, or maybe even sell it all to them, in some cases. So, yeah, curious to hear your thoughts.
It's a good question. Like, there are obviously things in terms of like the product in and of itself. To your point, like, these are clients who, you know, a lot of what they fear is making the wrong decision based on, you know, wrong data, right? So being able to have high accuracy and whatnot, but that obviously goes without saying when you're working with within our segment, that those things are important. I think if you look a little bit more about like how you get in the room to begin with, I think a lot of these firms, they truly embrace the fact, and it's really been, I've been really sort of positively surprised about how they actually are leaning into to adopting tools and want to invest in tools in this area as well. So I think what they're really looking for is it's not just a product that generally works well and solves their problem, but also looking for a company that they can partner with and sort of build alongside with and have a quite close relationship with. And I think a lot of what they find trust in is not that you're just a great technologist and that you're have a cracked engineering team, or like, really talented, PMs or designers or whatever it might be, but that you also have a team of people that go on site and again understand their world and sort of, understand the everyday life of being in the trenches of an investment banker, or a PE associate and whatnot. And I think that's one of the things that we see when we sort of work with clients that are also working with some of the big foundational models. There are times where we end up taking, the entire client, they just use Hebbia as the tool. There are also times where they might want to use, the foundational models more for like the lightweight sort of everyday questions and whatnot, and we get used for the more sort of heavy, more challenging, more complex analysis. And in both cases, I think what oftentimes gets noted by our clients is that they find a lot of value in working with, a team who understand again what a sim is, or what an IC memo looks like, or why like a certain output isn't something else. And I think that's also something that has, I wouldn't say maybe surprised me, but definitely been a constant reminder, especially working in this area, in my specific area, which is about producing again PowerPoints and Excels and whatnot. With my background from McKinsey, one of the things that I always found sort of, I think at that time frustrating, but it's also where I think, we find a lot of edge, is that when these people are sending over a PowerPoint, it's not just to sort of like update the company on, the latest changes and how sales was last month and whatnot. They're ultimately pitching in on, deals that are millions and millions in value, but that are also hugely important, whether it's building out new data centers or whatever it might be. So you want to get that just right. You can't live with a 90%. You can't live with, something that's average, or doesn't follow their standards, or doesn't meet sort of their expectations in terms of. So when you look at it from as a pure technologist, you might be like, hey, we got a single prompt and we generated this entire PowerPoint, like, and it has your colors and logos and whatnot. How amazing is that? Like, and as a PM or an engineer, you can appreciate how much work goes into that. But from our client's perspective, they don't really care about how challenging that problem was to solve from a software engineering perspective. They care about, if this was a document that I was sending over to my clients, would that meet the standards of my firm? And if you can't get there, then it's not really that helpful, to be honest, right? And I think that's something that, if you're building in the space, I think there's a risk, especially, maybe you can make the argument that right now, where everyone can be building, maybe you see less of that sort of like technologist first approach. But I think there's always a challenge that, because you are the one who's been building it, and because you've gone through all these iteration of like trying to just make the tool work, that you lose a little bit, the perspective that that's not what these companies care about. They don't care about, like, the hoops that you had to jump in order to make this like Excel plugin work really well. They're looking at it as like, does that fundamentally solve the job to be done? And that's not just going from a prompt to a spreadsheet or from a prompt to a PowerPoint. It has like so many more layers. So I think really having a lot of empathy for the clients and their specific use cases, trying to get as deep as you can understanding it, and again sort of like pairing up with people that has background in that specific industry, has been a huge unlock for us. And as much as I think our engineering team and deserves so much credit for everything that we've built, I also think the people that we have working alongside our clients can overstate how important they are for ultimately bringing together a product that solves real problems out there, and is not just sort of like a gimmicky thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great reminder, and I can definitely appreciate how your background helps you, like, specifically understand those teams and their needs better. And of course, having people on the ground who are also working with them, um, to get them from that 90% to something that they can closer to what they could actually deliver to a client. So that's,
Mm.
super cool to hear your perspective on that. Makes a lot of sense. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing that and for joining us on Future Proof today.
100%, a pleasure, Ethan, and thanks so much for inviting me.